Okay. Let's test the sound. Test 1, 2, 3. Test 1, 2, 3. Okay. Welcome. Dis&datInformation, 29 August 2025. We have to end on time today because I'm going to assume that Adnan Hussein is going to do his office hours at the usual time. So we best get started. We're looking at Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism. I'm going to try this again. Leave us try this messiness again. Hello, everyone. Dis&datInformation, 29 August. Alyssa Battistoni's Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, chapter 2. Unfree to choose, capitalist rule and existential freedom. There are many accounts of what exactly is wrong with capitalism. Critics charge it with stealing from the worker, degrading human relationships, generating inequality, exacerbating racial division, and reifying gender hierarchy. Others claim that capitalism is simply dysfunctional, doomed to repeated cycles of crisis until its eventual collapse. When it comes to ecological issues, though, the problem can seem obvious. Capitalism destroys nature. Variations on this theme abound. Capitalism has opened up a quote-unquote metabolic rift in the relationship between humanity and non-human nature. It has quote-unquote alienated human beings from nature, including our own. Capitalism dominates nature, using it instrumentally rather than recognizing its intrinsic value or fundamental alterity. Capitalism is degrading our earthly home, and the burdens of that destruction are borne unequally among human beings, just as capitalism's benefits are unevenly distributed. Capitalism is generating new crises by undermining the background conditions of its own functioning, and perhaps even destroying itself in the process. The problem with the free gift might seem to follow in this train, revealing that capitalism, as Marx claims, robs both the worker and the soil, that it doesn't pay its true ecological costs, just as it doesn't pay the worker the true value of their labor. Now, these arguments are compelling. There's clearly something to them. The state of our planet is evidence enough that something is deeply wrong, but their foundations are unstable. Many ecological critiques of capitalism, perhaps most, are ultimately rooted in a morally significant but underspecified idea of nature. To criticize capitalism's destruction, domination, or degradation of nature requires some idea of what nature is and why it should be protected. Now, those are points often taken for granted. Perhaps they seem too obvious to elaborate. But upon some reflection, the simple idea of nature turns out to be complicated indeed. If the non-human world is always in flux, as we have known it to be, at least since Darwin, what exactly is the nature that capitalism is destroying? Metabolisms themselves are changeable things. What makes any given metabolism worth preserving? How can human beings destroy nature if we are part of nature, as ecological thinkers often remind us that we are? What makes our transformation of the material world more destructive than the transformations wrought by termites or coral or bowerbirds? What would it mean to use or consume nature without destroying it, or to truly reciprocate nature's gifts? Can we even say that nature is being destroyed at all? After all, ash trees may be struggling, but ash borers are thriving. Why, for that matter, do the likes of forests and marshes count as nature, while non-human elements of the built environment, like a skyscraper or a swimming pool, do not? Conversely, if nature has already come to an end, as many theorists of the Anthropocene claim, what is there left to protect, conserve, or defend? What makes nature worth protecting, defending, or restoring in the first place? And which natures do we have in mind? When we take a critical stance on nature itself, in other words, is it harder to know how capitalism has wronged it? The point isn't that doing so leaves us without resources for judgment or critique. Far from it. If anything, it demands that we make the arguments underlying our judgments more explicit. That is, why should we privilege the ash tree over the ash borer insect, or why we might justifiably intervene in human reproductive cycles, but not in ecological metabolisms? Why we think some aspects of nature must be protected to enhance human well-being, and why some might be worth protecting even at a cost to ourselves. The problem comes when critics of capitalism play a moralized nature as a trump card, one that disguises underlying judgments and assumptions. In doing so, they abdicate the truly challenging questions before us, questions about how we should live and why. Many of the consequences that ecological critics of capitalism identify are indeed deeply troubling, but troubling consequences mark the beginning of critique rather than the end. Our judgment of capitalism can't lie only in empirical measurements of wealth or pollution, sheer statistics of poverty or biodiversity, as if these things speak for themselves. It has to rather lie in our assessments of what these indicators mean for our determination of whether the world we have is a good one, and ultimately whether we feel we have made this world at all. Instead of focusing on consequences themselves, on what we are doing to nature, or what capitalism is doing to us, on metrics of economic growth or physical throughput, Alyssa, follows the structure of action that produces them. And that places outcomes so out of our control. The problem with capitalism, this book argues, is that it makes us unfree. This unfreedom distorts our ability to make decisions about how to relate to one another as human beings, as well as to the vast array of non-human beings that make up our world. And it thwarts our ability to take responsibility for those decisions. This is a critique rooted not in external standards for judgment as given by nature, but in the belief that we ultimately should be able to make these decisions for ourselves. Where many recent critiques of capitalist unfreedom have taken inspiration from the Republican principle of non-domination, mine, that is Alyssa's, looks elsewhere, to the freedom to choose, as articulated in the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir. To be human, for Sartre and Beauvoir, is to be faced with a choice about how to be, to even be able to conceive of such a choice. Freedom, in turn, consists in the possibility of choosing to be other than what we are and taking responsibility for what we decide. It is precisely this kind of indeterminacy, the idea that human social life can be other than what it is, that underpins the critique of social forms, as we've seen. It is this indeterminacy, too, that drives the existentialist claim that our values are given neither by God nor nature nor custom, and must be grounded in our freedom alone. The project of the human life for Sartre and Beauvoir is to be what one chooses and to commit oneself to those choices through action in the world. The freedom to choose is often dismissed as the slogan of neoliberalism, seen as the impoverished or even ugly freedom of the sovereign consumer. The title of Milton and Rose Friedman's full-throated defense of capitalism, free to choose, could double for that of an existentialist manifesto. To some, this may seem troubling, yet the freedom to choose is worth defending, just as the formal institution of free and equal labor, however substantially limited and incompletely realized as emancipatory elements, so too does the market's challenge to naturalized social values, however partial and often distorted, have liberatory dimensions, as Marx himself recognized. Footnote 12. Proponents of the freedom to choose are not wrong to reject the fixity or moral values or emphasize the importance of deciding what we think is most important, rather than reading this resonance as the sign of a damning elective affinity. Then I show how, that is, Alyssa shows, how existentialist accounts of the freedom to choose our values can reveal the inadequacy of capitalist accounts of freedom. Capitalist freedom on this view is a perversion rather than the realization of existentialist freedom, insofar as it undercuts our ability to make genuine choices and to take genuine responsibility for our actions. Capitalist unfreedom has two main components, what I describe as market rule and class rule. Rule is typically associated with the classic question, who rules? Typically taken to be synonymous with the question, who governs? Footnote 13. Traced to the ancient Greek arch, or arche, it is generally thought to describe explicitly political systems of governance. Alyssa's argument is not that capitalism is a political system in itself in the manner of democracy or aristocracy. It is primarily a mode of production. But the way that capitalism structures economic decisions, although ostensibly distinguished from political ones, sets the terms for decision-making writ large. Each of capitalism's core dimensions, that is, private control of the means of production and investment and generalized dependence on markets, which serve as the primary mode of allocation and distribution, corresponds to a particular modality of rule, which together constitute capitalism as a system of unfreedom. What I call, that is what Alyssa calls, class rule is a form of the rule of the few over the many, channeled through private ownership of the means of production and private power over investment. This form of unfreedom is often discussed in terms of the power that the capitalist holds over the worker. As I argue, however, class rule extends beyond workplace domination or even the class relation between labor and capital described by radical Republicans and classical Marxists. It consists in the concentration in private hands of power over investment and hence over the ability to remake the world. Although critiques of consumption tend to point a finger at widespread complicity in environmental destruction, private control over production and investment means that decisions made by a tiny fraction of people, themselves subject to the competitive pressure of the market, fundamentally shape the world in which the rest of us live. A second aspect of unfreedom, one that is less easily diagnosed, is what I call, that Alyssa calls, market rule. Market freedom is the mechanism on which capitalism's defenders tended to stake both pragmatic and moral arguments. In the market, it said, people meet as formal equals, unmarked by status, buying and selling whatever they choose, including, vitally, their own labor power to whoever will buy or sell from them. Markets allow us to decide for ourselves what is in our own interest and pursue it to the best of our ability. Markets offer a way to coordinate action through voluntary exchange rather than violent coercion, promising a social order to which everyone is consented and which, it's often argued, produces benefits for all. Skeptics have typically responded by debunking these principles of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham as illusory, pointing to the class relation that lurks between the seemingly equal surface of exchange, footnote 16. My analysis instead looks more closely at the structure of market action itself in order to diagnose the unfreedoms the market generates in its own right. What does it mean to live in a society in which markets mediate so many of our actions? If the market is the site of freedom, why does it often leave us feeling helpless? So, market rule underscores the novelty of political life in a society where the vast majority of decisions are made and carried out through sheer agglomeration of individual choices mediated by exchanges of goods. Our individual choices are limited not only as a matter of scale, not only, in other words, because they seem to be a minuscule drop in a massive bucket, but in their very structure, coordinated by an institution that simultaneously atomizes and aggregates our decisions in ways that defy both individual and collective control. The structure of market rule ultimately limits our ability to take responsibility for the world we've made and to commit ourselves to the value we purport to hold. Just as we're frequently compelled to treat other people as workers and competitors, we're compelled to treat non-human nature as a free gift, regardless of our individual ethical assessments or moral values. As I show in later chapters, these forms of rule illuminate drivers of environmental phenomena that are often described in terms of injustice or violence. Although injustice and violence are indeed often present, they tend to be downstream from these structuring features. Market and class rule do not apply only to our relationships to nature. However, they pervade life under capitalism more broadly. In fact, it's important that the critique of capitalism advanced in this book isn't specifically ecological. If, as I've argued, politics is inevitably bound up with the material world we call nature, we can't separate out the ecological critique of capitalism from a social one. A Marxist-existentialist account of unfreedom is particularly apt in this regard. In its insistence that values must not only be stated but lived, it roots freedom in the material world, as we'll explore most significantly in chapter 7. Now, while it echoes the classic Marxist critique of alienation in certain respects, moreover, it does so without essentializing either human nature or human relationships to the natural world. Rather than measuring capitalism's wrongness against a standard set by nature, it leaves open the questions of how we understand ourselves in relation to the more than human world of which we're a part. Next section, class rule and class power. Class rule is the most obvious form of capitalist unfreedom. While it appears easily legible in terms of the rule of the few over the many, it takes an unusual form, footnote 17. The few aren't the well-born or the wise. Their power isn't rooted in control of the organs of state power or channels of social influence. Their authority, rather, is conferred by sheer economic power and often bypasses public decision-making processes altogether. Class power names the distinctive forms of authority derived from privately held control over resources on which others rely to reproduce their lives. It is the power to command these resources as one pleases, and thus to command those who need access to them with little accountability except to the rule of the market itself. And yet, class rule is not merely the result of a maldistribution of wealth of the sort that political theorists have long described, for capital isn't simply wealth. The few, in this instance, are capital personified. They don't simply use the public sphere to pursue their own personal interests or even use their private wealth for their own advancement. Rather, they act to regenerate capital in perpetuity. Sounds familiar. Class rule is usually understood in terms of the domination of labor by capital. As Nicholas Brisalis argues, capital is just monetary title to control over the labor capacity of others. Capital, in other words, is the power to purchase another's time and decide how it will be used. The ability of one group of people to command the activity of another, rooted not in any politically legitimated decision, but merely in control over productive assets. It is this power that is typically seen as lurking beneath the mystifications of market freedom. Marx memorably descends from the realm of exchange, where relationships between persons merely appear to be equal to the realm of production, where the foundational division in social power between owners of capital and proletarians is revealed. Proletarians, he claims, are doubly free to work for whomever they please, but also free of property, and thus free to starve if they can't find a way to trade their sole asset, that is their own bodily capacity, to those who control all the other things that reproduction requires. At the heart of capitalist production, then, is the expectation that some people will regularly submit to the will of others, that some people will regularly be able to command the will of others. Now, this dimension of class rule is largely comprehensible within the Republican critique of domination. Within the workplace, both labor Republicans and theorists of the firm observe bosses and managers are entitled to exercise near unrestricted authority and have broad discretionary power over the terms of employment. Although workers enter into voluntary agreements to follow orders, the broader social relations of class leave them little choice but to accept the terms they're offered. Class rule, however, extends much further than accounts of workplace domination suggest, and takes a wider array of forms than analyses of labor alone recognize. For capital is not only titled to command the labor of others per Brisalis, but the power to organize production and direct investments more generally. While this aspect of class rule, stemming from power over investment, has rarely been explored by political theorists, it is essential to the analysis of capitalism. Footnote 23. It is the power to decide what is produced and in what quantities, where and how, and hence to make decisions about many other aspects of social and ecological life. It is the title to quarry vast mines and build enormous factories, to drill deep into the earth for hydrocarbons and convert ancient forests to plantations. Owners of capital have thus outsized power not only over the people whose labor they've purchased, or those with whom they enter into direct relationships of exchange, but over the conditions of life for many people who have entered into no formal agreement whatsoever. As when the owner of a factory that belches out smoke forcibly changes the conditions of life for those living in the neighborhood, the conditions of the local atmosphere, and even the global biosphere. Capital, then, is the power not only to produce commodities, but to produce the physical world without most people's consultation or consent. So class rule also operates in more expansive ways than most existing accounts address. It's often depicted, especially in neo-Republican accounts, in terms of the power to interfere with others, to actively direct or command their activity. The boss tells their employee to work faster or come in for an extra shift, or more egregiously, to change their behavior outside the workplace. Similarly, class power, understood as power over investment, is most obvious when it takes the form of active direction of production. The decision, for example, to drain a wetland to build a housing development or build an energy-intensive data center. But class rule is equally evident in its seeming absences in the ability to decide what not to produce, to decline to hire a worker, to disinvest from projects or regions, to withhold resources. It lies in the power to neglect those things that don't promise adequate returns, however needed they might be, and crucially, to do so without being held responsible for the outcomes that might result. Thus, pharmaceutical companies invest in research on diseases that afflict the wealthy while neglecting those that affect the poor. Real estate developers build luxury apartments rather than affordable housing. Financiers invest in fossil fuels rather than renewable energy. Now, we might find this dismaying, but it's not obviously wrong insofar as private actors are not expected to act for public ends. To characterize capitalism as a system of class rule does not emphatically mean that capitalists rule as they please, nor that they rule alone. Although class power is capitalist sine qua non, it is not the only kind of power that operates within it. It exists alongside, interacts with, exacerbates, and perhaps even generates forms of power and domination structured by other social categories like race and gender. Although class rule operates primarily through control over economic rather than political resources, moreover, it can be reinforced or curbed by political institutions. States, too, have power to undertake investment, albeit rarely with total autonomy from private capital. And of course, class rule can be combated and held in check by organization among those subjected to it. Perhaps more fundamentally, however, the decisions that owners of capital, which shape the world that the rest of us live in, are themselves made under and indeed compelled by what I call market rule. Capitalists are subject, above all, to the law of value, a law made not by any conscious actor, but emergent from countless individual decisions undertaken in competition. And as such, it's the market above all that directs, disciplines, and even commands them. The market is capitalism's governing body, the institution that structures action on a daily basis more than any other. Next section, market freedom, market rule. And now it's fairly obvious what's troubling about class rule, at least in societies where people are supposed to be political equals. This kind of unequal power has few defenders as such, but it can also seem unsatisfactory as an explanation for the complexity of agency, power, and responsibility in modern capitalist societies. The transformation of our planet is simply too vast to attribute to any single company or even industry. To point a finger at capital can seem to imply a simplistic portrait of greedy villains acting to enrich themselves at the expense of others, one that conveniently shifts responsibility to a few bad actors rather than acknowledging widespread complicity. Fossil fuel companies may drill for oil, but it's consumers who enjoy the benefits of burning it. Phenomena like climate change are the result of trillions of mundane choices. We each add some tiny amount of carbon to the atmosphere every time we eat or drive to work or buy a new outfit. When we order products from Amazon, when we forget to turn off the air conditioning, or even when we buy a new item of clothing. Elizabeth Anker argues we damage the environment with thoughtless patterns of consumption. Such arguments about climate complicity follow in a long train of anxieties about responsibility for unintentional and often unwitting harms done to others through consumption, from quote-unquote slave sugar to quote-unquote blood oil. They often carry a localized echo of Marx's critique of commodity fetishism, and joining us to spot the relations of domination lurking within the mere things we buy every day. Yet, they rarely confront the institution that channels these actions, that is, the market. Now, why is moral agency located so significantly in consumer choices? Why, even when we know our purchases are problematic, do we often feel so powerless to do anything about it? And how might we understand responsibility differently if we attended more closely to the way action is mediated by the market? The structure of responsibility in the market is challenging to grasp. It really is hard to see on the surface what is wrong with market choices. Even their most negative effects tend to emerge from interactions that are, on their face, unobjectionable. The kinds of ordinary legal transactions that we make unthinkably every day when we willingly enter into arrangements with others, making exchanges we find mutually satisfactory. The outcomes that many find troubling are ones that no one intends, arising from actions that no one in particular forces us to take. Some philosophers thus argue that despite our discomfort with these phenomena, there's actually no wrongdoing at all. Others identify problems that they struggle to diagnose. Republican critics of domination often acknowledge the force of the market, but bracket it to focus on forms of interpersonal domination more suited to the Republican framework. Accounts of abstract or social domination condemn the ways that the markets appear out of our control, but rarely articulate their specific normative dimensions. My account of market rule thus addresses this form of unfreedom and its mode of operation more directly. The market has often been thought of as anarchic, as the absence of rule. Markets are infamously volatile. It's no coincidence that Mercury is the god of commerce. But market rule isn't only chaotic, it is also intensely orderly. Markets cultivate subjects and inculcate practices. They discipline and punish. They generate familiar, even law-like patterns of action and structures of relationships among people, even if it's never clear who exactly will end up on top. These laws aren't given by nature, of course. They emerge from interactions among human beings. In their patterned, even orderly nature, however, they aren't the same as the laws we consciously make either. Market rule is self-sustaining and self-organizing, generated by the structured actions of many individual selves, but exceeding the will or action of any individual self in particular, a process without a subject, as Althusser puts. And also a political order without a subject. Footnote 32. Market rule reflects, in a sense, what Nico Kolodny describes as rule over none. It does not require that anyone in particular is subordinate to anyone else. But market rule is not the democratic promise of ruling and being ruled in turn. It is rather ruled by each simultaneously and also by no one in particular. It is ruled by all and by none. Market rule reflects the combined conditions of market dependence, wherein most people must acquire most of what they need through market exchange and market competition, which makes success and even survival contingent on contending with and besting others in the market. Market rule is oriented around a singular form of value against which all goods and actions are measured. It weighs on everyone, capitalists and workers, consumers and producers. In tandem with class rule, it becomes directional, oriented toward accumulation. Each capitalist obeys the immanent law and hence the moral imperative to produce as much surplus value as possible. Footnote 34. Capital flows to wherever it can find returns. It allocates labor and other resources accordingly. Value comes to operate as a regulative principle for society writ large. Market rule, then, is not anarchy, but axiarchy. The rule of value, footnote 35. Market freedom as non-responsibility. Now, to develop the account of market rule, it's necessary to look more closely at the claims made about market freedom. Markets are said to rely on uncoerced choices and consensual agreement. In the market, we each pursue our own self-interest, however we define it, making voluntary exchanges that we think will make us better off, and so does everybody else. Markets aggregate our individual actions into collective outcomes. Crucially, our motives have no bearing on these outcomes. Markets are indifferent to our purposes, seeing only prices. In other words, they detach intentions from consequences. As Eric McGalvray argues, then the fundamental principle of market freedom is non-responsibility. People are able to choose among the options offered by the market without being publicly accountable for the consequences of those decisions, and thus with the ability to impose certain costs on other people without their consent. An avocado fad may send farmers' fortunes rising and plummeting. A cultural propensity to save rather than spend may plunge the economy into recession and workers into unemployment, but no one in particular is at fault. No one is directly responsible for the prices of goods. No one is directly responsible for the distribution of income. Even where markets bring about detrimental outcomes, it's no one's intent and no one's fault that they do so. Now, condemnatory though it may sound, the charge of non-responsibility is not a critique. To the contrary, the disconnect between intention and result has often been a point in markets' favor. Ideas like Bernard Mondavi's private vices, public virtues, and Adam Smith's invisible hand take the optimistic view that individual actions motivated by self-interest turn out, however accidentally, to secure peace and prosperity for society as a whole. Markets do not require people to be wise, altruistic, or virtuous. They do not assume that people will take the common good into account or choose to act justly. Indeed, it is expected that they are not and will not. Those who act with no thought of the general welfare will nevertheless advance it, perhaps more so than those who act with the common good in mind. This is why markets often seemed to pose an answer to core problems of political thought, a form of order that takes people as they are and not as they might be, that realizes the common good treasured by the ancients while protecting the individual liberty prized by the moderns. Footnote 37. Now, if Smith and Mondavi had argued that the pursuit of individual freedoms expressed via the market would redound to the benefit of all, however, markets' 20th century defenders, thinkers like Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek, make no such promises. Instead, they suggest there's no way to assess what it is for the benefit of all. There's no such thing as society. There are only individuals and the choices they make about what would be best for them according to their own judgments and values. See Thatcher. If someone cares about preserving natural landscapes, they can choose to buy green products or donate to nature conservancies. What they cannot do is force others to contribute to these projects. Whereas states forcibly impose some people's preferences on others, in the market, the individual is the ultimate judge of his ends. If those choices just happen to upset the patterns we would prefer, per Robert Nozick, who are we to intervene? Footnote 40. This is, in other words, a stringent inconsequentialism rooted in the refusal of collective judgment altogether. The market, in this view, is a way of acting socially, but not cooperatively. People make free choices as individuals, and those individual choices are aggregated into what Hayek calls spontaneous order. Spontaneous order also reflects a view of unintended consequences as felicitous, as Daniel Lubin argues, but it strips away the explicit normative inflection of something like Mondaville's public virtue, even as it naturalizes the idea of spontaneity itself. Key to its realization is the fact that prices are a thin kind of knowledge, one that simply reflects information about supply and demand. When you buy a bunch of bananas, you don't need to know anything about the soil that nourished the trees on which they grew, or what kinds of noxious effects might have resulted from the process of farming them. It is not a problem, according to the theory of market freedom, that we don't know these things. To the contrary, it's a boon. It's precisely the limits of individual knowledge for Hayek that recommend the markets as a way of aggregating the knowledge of all. All you need to know is how much money you have, how much money things cost, and what your own priorities are. Now, this, of course, is the opposite of the idea that we bear moral responsibility for the effects of our consumer purchases, that we could act rightly if only we did enough research. If you could know everything that went into your purchases and calculate the best outcome for everyone on Earth, we wouldn't need markets at all. When Hayek proclaims that liberty and responsibility go together, then this is not responsibility as many moral philosophers imagine it. Responsibility for the effects of our decisions on other people, let alone for the direction or shape of collective life. Hayek's view of responsibility is perfectly compatible with the account of market freedom as non-responsibility. We are not, according to Hayek, accountable for our actions to any particular persona, or persons, sorry. Freedom is only the freedom to allocate one's own resources as one chooses towards the ends one prefers. Responsibility is only for our own individual choices about how we will allocate the resources that belong to us and for the results of those choices in our own lives. Now, if someone chooses to spend the resources on entertainment instead of food, why should we stop them? If they choose to live near a smoky factory where rent is cheap, why should we prevent them? If they choose a hazardous job over a safer one because the pay is better, why should we prohibit them? They will have to bear the consequences. But that is their choice. The same reasoning applies at the collective level. If we as a society have failed to value nature in the way that some people might prefer, it is simply because others have freely chosen to prioritize different things. If we're unhappy with the results, we must take a hard look in the mirror and at our own willingness to pay for the things we claim to value. Our spending may turn out to reveal more about our commitments than our proclamations. Footnote 45. Next section, Republican limits. The optimistic view of unintended consequences, as articulated by Smith and Mandeville, is easily countered with evidence of more pessimistic outcomes, as we will consider shortly. But Hayek's account of market freedom is more challenging for contemporary advocates of freedom, particularly those drawing on the Republican tradition to refute. Early modern Republicans were anxious that the rise of commerce threatened freedom. Understood in a classic Republican sense, markets, they worried, introduced servile dependence while eroding common purpose and arrogating the sphere of self-rule. Yet it is precisely the uncoupling of intention and result that has led many neo-Republicans since to see the market as a potential counter to the arbitrary power of one person over another. Now, if no one's responsible for the effects of their action on anyone else, no one can impose their will on anyone else. The market, after all, does away with the qualities of impersonal and intentional action at the heart of the Republican concept of domination. It disperses power and offers opportunity for exit. It is akin to a force of nature, Philip Pettit argues, and therefore not a source of domination. Radical republicanism, so potent for diagnosing workplace power, has thus proved ill-suited to addressing market unfreedom, and hence to confronting the diffuse forms of compulsion, interdependence, and impotence that saturate daily life under capitalism. The most robust defense of a Republican account of domination by the market is offered by William Clare Roberts, who argues that capitalism institutes a form of domination that is interpersonal, even if impersonal. The market, in its erraticism and unpredictability, constitutes the exercise of an arbitrary power, but the market itself is, as Roberts puts it, just people. And so it subjects us to other people's wills, even if indirectly and unintentionally. In dropping the requirement of intentionality, Roberts' account diverges significantly from the traditional Republican view, at least as articulated by Pettit, and indeed stretches the Republican concept of domination to the breaking point. As Roberts himself notes, the subjection of people to overarching law-like forces is a form of domination novel to modernity, one that a concept stemming from antiquity cannot quite grasp. That's questionable. But anyway, footnote 49. The Republican critique of non-domination, moreover, doesn't adequately counter the account of the market given by its defenders. Indeed, Hayek's own insistence that one person must not be subjected to the arbitrary will of another is easily read in terms of Republican liberty. Footnote 50. Hayek openly grants that the market is often out of our control, but nonetheless holds that the impersonal and seemingly irrational forces of the market are preferable to the equally uncontrollable and therefore arbitrary power of other men. Now, this is more obviously consistent with the neo-Republican view of non-domination than Roberts' account of domination as diffuse and impersonal. So there's that subtle difference. However, more appealing, we might find the latter, diffuse and impersonal, right? Critical theory offers its own diagnosis of capitalism, abstract, impersonal, or social domination, which Alyssa Battistoni describes as consisting not in the domination of people by other people, but in the domination of people by abstract social structures that people themselves constitute. Although people appear to be free to invest, consume, and labor as they wish, the critique holds they are compelled to act in ways that accord with the system's overall logic. What critical theorists describe as domination is therefore closer to a critique of alienation, describing the way that human activity comes to appear as an alien power out of our control than to the Republican critique of the arbitrary power of one person over another. Footnote 54. Yet this account of domination, as William Clare Roberts notes, is loosely defined and its normative dimensions underspecified. Critiques of social domination typically stop short of spelling out what exactly human freedom consists in or how the market inhabits it. Nor does this critique of domination quite land a blow against Hayek's defense of the market, where Hayek himself endorses market freedom on the grounds of something like self-determination. Markets, for Hayek, give us the freedom to choose what we as individuals value, to decide the direction of our lives for ourselves. And just as importantly, they force us to make choices about those values in the face of material constraints. So we could assert any number of principles in the abstract, but the things we choose to devote our limited resources to reflect our real commitments, far more than any mere statement of belief. Precisely by virtue of its limitations, then, the sphere of market choice is the air in which alone moral sense grows and in which moral values are daily recreated in the free decision of the individual. Footnote 55. The opportunity to build one's own life, Hayek argues, also means an unceasing task, a discipline that man must impose upon himself. This unceasing discipline, he argues, is why, quote unquote, many free people are afraid of liberty. Footnote 56. Now, the resonance with the Sartrean existentialism is striking. To choose for Sartre is to decide what we really value and what we want to be. And for Sartre, too, this is frightening. We alone are responsible for our choices, he emphasized, and this responsibility is hard to face, insofar as it leaves us with no excuses for our actions. Freedom is anguish, which people constantly seek to deny, and yet it is ultimately inescapable. Sartre, too, emphasizes the necessity of realizing our choices in the finite world, because human beings are at once embodied and conscious, subject and object, what Beauvoir describes as the condition of ambiguity. We cannot think about or articulate our values in the realm of ideas. We must commit ourselves to them in action and attempt to see them through. Now, this echo might seem suspicious. For Hayek, Alex Gorovich and Corey Robin argue the market provides opportunities for existential choice, but this is no compliment. In fact, they argue the market undercuts those who take moral values as fixed points around which to organize some consistent shape of a life, instead of driving us to treat values as temporary, contingent, and as unfixed as yesterday's choice and tomorrow's preference. Transactional. Sartre's embrace of contingency might seem equally fickle and overly compatible with Hayek's embrace of the market. In my view, however, it's precisely this resonance between Hayek's and Sartre's view of the freedom and duty to choose that makes Sartre's analysis of the constraints set on that freedom by the market a powerful rejoinder to Hayek. For what is most powerful in Hayek's view is precisely its intimation of an anti-foundationalist approach to value, and its insistence that we have no choice but to choose. We do have to make choices about what we value, and we have to do so not only in word, but in deed. We should look critically at appeals to a priori moral rules, communitarian virtues, or socially accepted norms. Footnote 60. It is crucial, in other words, to distinguish between the market's role in undermining our ability to make genuine and lasting commitments from the idea that fixed moral values are a preferable alternative to contingent values altogether. It is only by recognizing that values are contingent rather than given, after all, that we can freely choose them, and only because they are our values that we care if they're overridden. Now, the problem lies in Hayek's view of how freedom might be realized against the specter of quote-unquote society as a morally unitary monolith whose values are enforced by the state. Hayek offers a view of the social as constituted through the mere aggregation of isolated individuals connected only through their own private consumer choices, which they cannot meaningfully communicate about or even understand. This is really a mess. Footnote 61, this way of organizing both individual and collective action means not only that freedom is primarily expressed via the wildly unequally distributed medium of money, see, that's where it goes in terms of abstraction, but also that even those with vast sums of wealth cannot really express the values they claim to hold. The market makes it almost impossible, even for individuals, to choose their own ends, as Hayek proclaims they must, and all the more so for collectives. The market, in other words, limits the power of every person to make decisions that reflect their own values, as Hayek insists we ought to be able to do. So it's a fundamental contradiction. Markets as series, S-E-R-I-E-S, the structure of seriality. If the idea that we can be dominated by markets is an odd fit for republicanism and only loosely outlined by critical theory, its thrust is better captured by Sartre's concept of seriality outlined in his Critique of Dialectical Reason, 1964. Jean-Paul Sartre's effort in this text to reconcile his early individualist orientation with Marxism produces an unusual but generative theory of action as simultaneously atomized and social, undertaken by individuals who are at once isolated and connected by a socio-material structure whose action is deeply constrained by the relationships this structure imposes, but which remains, in some sense, theirs. Footnote 62. This account, importantly, refuses a dichotomy between conscious agency and underlying structure. People's economic roles are largely conferred by the broader social order, and their options are curbed by its mechanisms, but they remain conscious agents making choices even within severe constraints. In other words, people's actions are not fully determined by an economic structure or a set of quasi-natural forces, and they are not simply duped into acting irrationally, but nor are they really free. Footnote 63. A series, for Sartre, is a loosely constituted collective of individuals aggregated around objects, structures, or practices to which all bear the same relation. People waiting for a bus, in his most well-known example, exemplifies seriality. While individually different, each person bears the same relationship to the bus as a potential passenger. Members of a series are typically aware of one another, but their relationships to one another are impersonal and detached. Their actions adhere to the practices and rules associated with the bus, waiting in line, buying a ticket, etc. But they are undertaken in relative isolation. Insofar as members of a series act in relation to one another, they do so in anticipation that others are likely to act in the same way that they themselves are, unless you've got a boombox. Because they are interchangeable with respect to the object or structure, members of a series typically view one another as potential competitors. Each person who takes a seat on the bus threatens to block someone else from getting one. Because I expect the bus to be crowded at 5 p.m., I try not to take it until 7 p.m. Because I'm anxious about getting a seat, I rush to board as quickly as possible. As the example of the bus illustrates, seriality is not necessarily oppressive, and often it is insignificant. There's even something potentially liberatory about it, insofar as the feature of interchangeability reflects a condition of basic equality. People are not distinguished by status or personal characteristics. Seriality is always dangerous, however, in that it is an unconscious, habitual state in which we act in ways that reproduce familiar structures and relationships without interrogating or reflecting on them. It reflects a passive relationship to others as individuals and to social structures as a whole, one in which we're not acting consciously, and thus one in which we perpetually risk falling into bad faith. So if the bus is Sartre's most famous example, his real interest is in more complex social formations. Markets for Sartre are a prime example of seriality as a force which is suffered in impotence. The market has an undeniable reality that is imposed on everyone, but which no one freely chooses. This imposition is of a distinctive kind. Although sellers are in a competitive relationship to one another, theirs is not the antagonism of direct struggle in which the winner gains the power to impose conditions directly on the loser. It is not, in other words, a Hegelian struggle between lord and bondsman, or a Republican instance of the master who exercises arbitrary power over a slave, but rather a situation in which everyone is the abstract other to everyone else. People act in anticipation of others' actions, often hastening the effect that they anticipate in the process. For example, when people dump stock that they fear will decline in price, they help to bring about its crash. This anticipatory relationship is in some ways reminiscent of that described by Republicans, in which someone who is subject to the arbitrary power of another acts in servile expectation of the more powerful person's desires and commands. Trump and Putin. But the difference is that in the market, there is no actual person giving commands. The relationship between any given buyer and seller is conditioned by relationships among thousands, millions, even billions of other buyers and sellers, all expressed through the medium of price. We act in anticipation of the actions of anonymous others, whom we do not know and will likely never meet. People who have no direct power over us and never will, and who themselves are acting in anticipation of us. Prices themselves are collective objects constituted through the actions of people composed as a series. Although they're generated by the indirect relationships among people, their strength comes from each individual's impotence relative to the collective. Prices in capitalist markets effectively hide decision-making not only about the worth of individual goods, but about their worth relative to others. It's not really possible to evaluate one good in its own right. The price of any given good or service is determined only relative to the movement of the economy as a whole. These anonymous individual actions collectively generate outcomes that no one in particular intends, but which everyone must obey. Prices are realities which we are subjected to and which we live. They convey acts which we have to do. The market thus appears as an objective but alien necessity in every one of us. Its relations are what Iris Marion Young describes as structured relations of alienation and anonymity that are felt as constraints on everyone. Footnote 69. Decisions in the market are said to reflect our preferences, at least the preferences of those who have the money to express them. Those who don't are largely invisible to the market. And in this, the poor future generations and non-human species are in more or less the same boat. Even those who do have money, however, cannot simply choose what value they would like to attribute to different goods. I may think clean air is worth a great deal, for example, but in a true market, I cannot pay what I think something is worth, or even what I negotiate with another individual. I can only pay what the market, that is the aggregation of millions of other buyers and sellers making transactions in competition with one another, decides it's worth, which may well be nothing at all. In the language of economics, as individuals, we're all price takers rather than price makers. If the ends to which we wish to commit ourselves include not only the fulfillment of our own personal desires, but concern for the well-being of others, moreover, if we are committed to not consuming products made with child labor or to not deforesting Indonesian jungles, we will find ourselves even more constrained. Insofar as the principle of market freedom as non-responsibility enshrines precisely the idea that we are not responsible to others for the effects of our actions. Under capitalism, market rule is the dominant form of appearance of seriality. Under conditions of near universal market dependence, in turn, in which nearly all our decisions are market-mediated, non-responsibility is pervasive. And the freedom that constitutes or that consists in being responsible for our decisions is radically elusive. The strict separation of intent and consequences, the devolution of decisions to individuals alone, and the serial nature of those decisions means that the shape of the world is not one we have chosen in any meaningful sense. There is something perverse, then, about critiques of complicity that stop short of criticizing market freedom itself. We are thrown into a world in which we're enjoined to buy and sell the things we need to survive, told to think only of our own needs and leave coordination up to the market, then suddenly charged with responsibility for the harms we inadvertently perpetrate. However much we agonize over our consumer choices, the market is not and cannot be a site for the exercise of collective reasoning, dialogue, deliberation, or reflection. Even decisions ostensibly made outside the market via expressly political and deliberative institutions, moreover, are often informed by market rule. Governments at levels ranging from the municipal to the national exist in seriality in their own right, competing to attract private investment that can supply jobs for residents and sources of tax revenue to fund their own operations. To do so, they may relax environmental regulations, fast-track permitting processes, or even actively incite polluting industries, or bring in the National Guard. The more dire the straits of the political community in question, perhaps because they are suffering the aftermath of deindustrialization or deeply indebted following an externally imposed structural readjustment program, or bearing the legacy of colonial rule, the worse the options will be. District of Columbia. Later chapters explore the configurations of market rule with other kinds of authority, from the market subordination that occurs when interpersonal domination is intensified by the market to the market abjection that comes with dependence on the market alone. Much of the book, however, focuses on the combination of market and class rule, which is intrinsic rather than contingent to capitalism. For as I've suggested above, capitalists too exist in seriality. They act in anticipation of what rivals will do, and the knowledge that they will ultimately be disciplined by the merciless rule of the market. Well, some will. Indeed, although market rule is most painful for the poor, it is typically most acute for capitalists. Consumers and workers are sensitive to prices, of course, often to the point that we would neglect other kinds of preferences. We might take a job we dislike in order to make a higher wage, or buy a good that we know is morally troubling, a car powered by internal combustion rather than electricity, perhaps, because the price is right. Roberts describes his tendency to respond to prices rather than act on one's own judgment in terms of akrasia. Akrasia. A-K-R-A-S-I-A. Footnote 73. But we can, so long as we're able to, meet our basic material needs, forego financial gain in hopes of realizing ethical values we suspect aren't reflected in market valuations. Anyway, we'll continue more on Monday. We're about halfway through the chapter, and because we have something else to do, we will. Come on. We will stop. We will stop